There are three things you can do to help us out.
1, you can make sure you subscribe to this channel.
2 is you can leave a comment here or on Apple Podcasts.
And 3, if you really want to help, you can follow this link to see how you could be a supporter on Patreon.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a view.
Hey, so welcome to another Word in Your Attic. You may well have seen earlier during the great lockdown, life was briefly lightened by the appearance of a thing on the internet called 64 Reasons to Celebrate Paul McCartney, which we very much enjoyed, and loads of other people did enjoy it as well. And it was work of Ian Leslie, who joins us now. Ian, this is not what you mainly do, is it? You're described, I think, on your website as author, adman, speaker, and spy. Take us through those 4 things.
Particularly spy.
There you go. I mean, that raises the question of, do I mainly do anything? I'm not sure. But the how it unfolded is that my first career was in advertising, and I worked in Adland in London and New York for a long time. And then I had a kind of early midlife crisis, which I recommend. You should, I'm sure you've had a few. You need to get them in.
It's a bit late for Mark and I, but
you bought a motorcycle? What happened?
I think it's something you just have to keep coming back to. You have to have a midlife crisis every 10 years. And I thought, well, this is fun, but I don't want to do it my whole life. I quite like writing, so maybe I could start a writing career. So I went sort of part-time. I went freelance and effectively part-time in advertising, and started writing. And I write books in that kind of human behavior, that Malcolm Gladwell.
I was going to say, I thought, shall I mention Malcolm Gladwell or shall I not?
No, I mean, I'm a big fan of Mr. Gladwell, and I mean, and love him or loathe him, he opened up a whole new kind of
didn't he just
genre, for better or for worse, which is not something many people achieve. So I write books. I wrote a book about curiosity. My latest book is about disagreement and conflict. And I write various journalism as well. I write for the New Statesman and Guardian and The Economist, 1843. I do lots of different things. I can't talk about the spy work. Obviously, I shouldn't really have mentioned it.
You've tweeted very vigorously about the football. I just have to ask one question as a writer of books about human behavior, which is that Giorgio Chiellini, was he deliberately psyching out the Spanish captain before the penalties with all that kind of forced bonhomie and punching him on the shoulder and putting his arm around him? Or was that a destabilizing tactic, do you think?
I don't know if it's like, I mean, yes, is my short answer, but I don't think he does it consciously, like strategically. I think that's just how he is. I think, the people that observe him and watch him say, he's always kind of kidding around, but he's the kind of kidding around that terrifies people like me.
Absolutely.
You get near that kid in the playground that's kidding around, you're like, oh my God. It's horrifying, and it is a form of dominance, and it's hilarious to watch, but I sort of felt sorry for.
So did I.
Alba as well.
Don't you think it's also based in the fact that he's taller than him, isn't it?
Yeah.
So he's looming over him.
You think at any point he's going to punch him?
You must have seen those pictures of Lyndon Johnson, when Lyndon Johnson was leader of the Senate. Every picture you see of Lyndon Johnson, who was a huge man, with another politician, doesn't matter who they are, he's looming over them, and he's holding the collar of their jacket. It's complete physical dominance. And
they look completely destabilized.
You would be. You'd be absolutely terrified.
You're absolutely right. That is the visual reference. And there's one particular sort of set of 3 or 4 photos that were taken over a minute or two of him having a discussion in a corridor, and this little guy was crouching down.
Yes, absolutely. Like this. It's terrifying.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was like.
Yeah. So anyway, our traditional first question is: can you remember the record-playing machinery that was in your home when you were a child?
I get panicked when anybody says, "Can you remember?" Because generally I just can't remember anything, but luckily I can remember that. So my mum and dad had a gramophone, it was kind of beautiful, kind of walnut wood, long thing with a lid that you opened up and a
radiogram. We're talking about.
Did it have a built-in radio?
Right.
It's an item of furniture.
Did it have kind of carved legs or anything like that?
Not sure if it had carved legs, but I think radiogram sounds.
Yeah, that'd be it.
Yeah, because I think it did have a radio inside it as well, and a place for the LPs, so I used to spend a lot of time in that room. My parents, they didn't have a massive collection of rock music. My dad was, by that time, he was more into classical music, but they had some, and they had, I was going to show you this. So they had this.
A collection of Beatles oldies.
That's a great one. Yeah.
And I started to listen to that.
Is that how you discovered the Beatles then?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
So while we've got a collection of the Beatles oldies in the house, in the room, we should just remind ourselves of a few things here. What year did that record come out?
Yeah.
Described as the Beatles oldies. 66, I think. 1966. And it also, it has on the cover that kind of Alan Aldridge style sort of swinging London psychedelia. Maybe 67, I don't know. Flares, I don't know. 66, I would have thought. But on the back, it's got a rather hippie, trippy picture of them, hasn't it? Yes. Taken by Robert Whittaker. No, taken by Robert Whittaker in Tokyo, I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it looks like Tokyo, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So they were, you probably know this better than me, David, but I think they're kind of stuck in Tokyo for a while. And now I didn't know any of this, but I became obsessed by this photo. Not obsessed, but it was kind of important to me because I just thought they looked possibly glamorous and just so cool. The Beatles weren't always cool. They were, in inverted commas, they had lots of different images, but for around 1965-66 they were cool, right? And here I think you can see them at their peak. Like they just look great.
Well, they're the whole of Oasis's career is entirely based on that
picture.
It is.
Right. The shades, they'd all discover different shades.
We will form a group that look like that. What it will sound like, I don't know, but it'll look like that, and it was the most influential look in British rock ever because it's still going on.
And I don't know what else it is about the image. Maybe it's just the feeling of them, the camaraderie and just the friendship that you can see. And there's just I don't know. It's just cool. But yeah, I love the fact they're already talking about oldies, and I love that in the Beatles' career generally. They're singing "She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah" on "All You Need Is Love." That like they're kind of nostalgic about their own career.
Yes.
At this incredible kind of rate.
The walrus was Paul. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was what your parents had around the place. Did they have the Sound of Music as well, or the Simon and Garfunkel's Greatest Hits, or whatever?
Well, they had they had Simon and Garfunkel. They had Bridge Over Troubled Water, which again, formative for me. And then I had some Cat Stevens, also very good. But and then and there was lots of Frank Sinatra and lots of classical music. So those are my dad's two great passions. So Sinatra and classical. But there was enough kind of, which I did get into as well, but there was enough kind of rock music there for me to, and then I went to the local library and started getting things out.
Oh, really? You borrowed?
What sort of things did you get?
Well, I started exploring the other Beatles albums, and then I got into the hard stuff. I got into kind of solo McCartney and Wings. So it's a terrible descent into kind of my drug hell. And then but I also got into Billy Joel. I mean, I was not a cool kid. This was so in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s. My peers at school were listening to really, soul and electro and sort of early hip hop as you got towards the end. And I was listening to Billy Joel, the Innocent Man, or you know, Tug of War by McCartney. So I think this is his best solo work, guys. They'd be like, right.
You write about in your 64 Reasons to Celebrate McCartney, you write about that idea that Lennon was a kind of soulful, deep and radical person. You know, that was the general perception, that McCartney's shallow and trivial and bourgeois, you know. Do you think that still persists? And were you even aware of that back then? Because even in the 70s, people were thinking the division had started, hadn't it? People were backing Lennon.
Well, I think it started when they split. And you know, the musical, the fan and critical community was so upset by the split that they wanted to blame somebody, and it had to be Paul. And John was very good at kind of spinning the story.
Yeah.
And so so this idea took hold, and I think it still holds today. Less so, I think it's changing. But the feeling that John was he was the genius with a capital G. He was the deep, creative, visionary force of the Beatles, and McCartney was a very clever, accomplished musician and songwriter and melodist. By the way, and melodists always get derided as slightly shallow.
Don't they?
They do, yeah.
Generally by writers, because writers concentrate on words because they can understand them.
Yeah.
They got
and also
about.
melody they associate with happiness, and happiness is harder to enthuse about and write about than sadness.
Yeah,
right.
And to compose songs in that idiom too. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting, and you know, and so I think Lennon. Yeah, that's interesting that with the writers that because Lennon was really more focused on the words. I mean, we're not talking about huge differences between the two here, but I think Lennon was more word focused, and so writers obviously think that's wonderful. So the kind of narrative of the Beatles was fixed, and also the fact that it was John's group. John decided that he'd had enough. He wanted a divorce, and then everybody else just had. Again, it was always kind of like John was the dominant kind of alpha male creative force of this group, and the others were just satellites, including Paul. So I do think that, so part of the reason I wanted to write the piece was to counterbalance that and just say, I don't think you really, you know, we haven't grasped the incredible contribution he made to the group and just the sheer range and depth of his talents. Whether it's as instrumentalist or producer, as well as a songwriter, before we even get to the songwriting, which is obviously incredible. And, you know, he's maybe one of the greatest songwriters ever, if not the greatest. You could just put that to one side and say, let's just look at him as a bass player, a guitarist, an arranger, a producer, everything. And you say, oh, he's already one of the greats. So phenomenal kind of.
There's my new thinking about the Beatles, actually, generally. Forget the songwriting. Just forget that for a moment. Just think about them as a group. They're just utterly remarkable as a group.
Right.
So Billy Joel was among your great first passions. Is this a teenager or?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know where I picked it up from. Maybe I just picked it up from the radio or something in an LP in the library. But again, I mean, not surprising actually. If you're into Paul McCartney, Billy Joel is not, you know,
it's not that far away, is it?
Yeah. And I mean, just another wonderful melodist. And I was really into An Innocent Man, that album. And then I started to go backwards and listen to The Stranger and then I went through a period where I felt like this is really shameful. I shouldn't be listening to Billy Joel. It's probably when I got to university, or Paul McCartney. This is just embarrassing. But you know, we go through these phases. You come back to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
They were really great.
So, what year did you go to university?
94.
Okay, 94.
So, what was the first group
did you take up to university in 1994? Did you take An Innocent Man? I love that.
Right, with your new scarf and your Jaffa cakes. That's right.
Yeah. And, you know, Wings.
Hey, everybody, back to my room.
Yeah. Come on, guys. Have you ever listened to the Third Wings album? Remember, return to form.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. That's
so you became intensely self-conscious about this. And I thought, I've got to change tack.
Everybody does. And you become intensely self-conscious about also just about liking pop music. You know, if you were into whatever it was, even like the Eurythmics or something, it sort of became a bit uncool. However, I have to say, there was a parallel influence on me at the time, which was pulling me in a different direction, which I'm now remembering, which is I was a really big fan of the Melody Maker.
Oh, right.
Which
you really go the unpopular route.
Yeah. It was
like this unfashionable thing.
Most unpopular music.
Who were the writers when you were reading it then? This is what? Was this around 90?
So this is just, around the end of the 80s, the early 90s. And they had this kind of cadre of incredibly pretentious intellectual writers.
Name names.
Well, but then I say incredibly pretentious intellectual, but they were also brilliant. So one of them was Simon Reynolds.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah.
Is a fantastic, still is a fantastic writer. David Stubbs.
All right.
Chris Jones, I think. And they had a kind of ideology as a magazine, which is kind of, not common these days, but they had a very kind of collective kind of philosophy of music. And they were really big on bands, which actually I didn't get into. I just liked reading about them. But they were really big on My Bloody Valentine and kind of noise-driven rock music. My Dinosaur Jr. Dinosaur Jr.?
Dinosaur Jr.
Yeah.
And but also they would bring all these kind of like intellectual ideas. So they brought a lot of like critical theory, which people talk about all the time now. They talked about, and they would apply the ideas of Derrida and Foucault and Baudrillard, postmodernism, something they talked about a lot, to, this kind of crap indie song. And it was intoxicating.
You're
and actually
almost sucking the joy out of this somehow. But you got a lot of fun out of it.
But then they hated you guys.
Yeah.
Oh, so they would do.
Yeah.
That was part of the fun of it. They were like, oh, and then the Q guys, they love Dire Straits and CDs, which is the devil. And they just don't get it. They think music is just something you put on in the car.
You see, that's the interesting thing about. I was going to say this here. You're right about human behavior. You really ought to write a book about people's behavior around music, because it purports that their discussions about music are never about music. They're always about personality or politics or economic differences or
it's the group strategy,
what people are wearing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's never actually about the music, So you reduce it. Yeah. And it's so interesting that people's passions for music they're usually defined by being in opposition to something. It's not that I particularly love Dinosaur Jr. It's that I hate Dire Straits. And so the expression of how much I hate Dire Straits is, look, I love Dinosaur Jr.
Yeah.
And it's such a shame.
I may not listen to them very much, but I certainly go on about them. They represent me.
Yeah. But we always used to think on music papers that, I know what you mean, that I used to read The Enemy in the 70s or whatever, which I was always being introduced to things I didn't understand. And that was part of the charm.
It was. And so, I'm a big kind of, the older I get, in fact, the more I appreciate pretension. I actually think pretension is a force for good in lots of ways, because you start off by pretending to something, and then you can actually get something. I remember this story that David Bowie told in an interview about how when he was a young man, he used to get on the tube, whatever, with a book of existentialist philosophy out in his pocket with a title just positioned so that you could see it, and then he would get it out and he would read it, and he said, I never read it, of course, but then he said, but then I did start to read it, and I thought, this is quite interesting, actually.
Yeah.
And it became a kind of passion of mine, and I think that that happens quite a lot. You could start off by liking something for the wrong reasons, but you end up appreciating it authentically.
Do you think, sorry, I've only just thought of this, do you think now that we all live online that still happens? Because so much of this stuff used to be about the displaying in public of things that you carried around, books or records or whatever, that you pretended to be into, that you maybe didn't understand. Do you think people still do that now that we all live online?
Yeah, because you can't tell what people are reading on the tube anymore, can you?
Yeah, I mean, you can post a link on social media that indicates that you're really clever, but you don't have any, you know, there's nothing triggering you to read it if you're not interested in it. And so when you've got a book, like you have the actual thing or an LP, and you're like, well, I might as well, you know, I actually read this thing or actually listen to it. So yeah, it's and there maybe is just less kind of public signaling in physical places.
Did the Melody Maker then direct you towards a load of groups that you developed a kind of passion towards?
One in particular, I mean, yes, they did, and I mean, they were very big on Prince, for instance. It wasn't all kind of obscure stuff, but they were really into Scritti.
Oh, right, okay.
And there was a kind of joyful confluence of band and writer here, because as you know, Green Gartside is very intellectual, pretentious, whatever. But he was very into kind of all this stuff, French philosophy, postmodernism, and I really loved him, and I loved reading his interviews. I loved his lyrics. I still do. I think they're incredible, and I loved his music. And actually, I studied English literature at Sussex University. And part of the reason I chose that course was that it was really big on all these French theorists and all these philosophers. So Scritti and the Melody Maker had a big kind of influence on the course of my life.
Signed up, can I go to the Melody Maker course? That's what you said, wasn't it?
Basically.
They could have done a course. They could have marketed themselves as that. Yeah. Have you been reading the Melody Maker in sixth form? This is the place you're to
That's
come.
true. First lecture, Jacques Derrida. Exactly.
It
would have been packed with pale and interesting men in old T-shirts.
I tell you, the interesting thing about Green, though, I do think, and you know more about this than I would do, is whenever I hear him talking about music, he's really interesting. Because he's actually got things to say about music as music, not just what it signifies and so forth.
Now, I agree. Yeah, I for a time that was a great kind of framing, because for a time I thought, I've just remembered something else I want to do. But I was really interested in his ideas, but I wanted to know, was it like doesn't he just love music, or is this just all theory to him? And actually, you start to realize, once you read more, and also just listen to his music, you know, he's an incredible musician, and he's a great melodist, by the way, you know, and he loves music that you wouldn't expect to, you know, he's a great fan of folk music and English folk. And so, he's just got a brilliant mind. But what I remembered was that I mentioned Simon Reynolds earlier. I was so kind of interested in Scritti Politti, and I was trying to understand what he was talking about this postmodernism, post-structuralism, whatever, that I wrote to Simon Reynolds and said, can you explain it to me? And he wrote me a lovely long letter back explaining it to me.
Oh, right, good.
Which again was like, you know, foundational to me pursuing my education and so on and so forth. So I don't know if this...
That's the virtue of it. I bet IBC didn't think of that as one of the services they were offering, did they? When they were stable full of magazines, they got somebody writing somebody explaining postmodernism, and very valuable service.
It was a lovely thing to do.
Yeah, no, sure. Were you ever in a band yourself?
Do you know what? I was very briefly in a band. I played very rudimentary guitar in a kind of very rudimentary rock and roll band that we played for one gig. I think we were probably like the Quarrymen. What
were you called?
You were
have a name?
You know what? I should have thought of this, because I actually can't remember at the moment. But it was a pretty ignominious kind of.
Were any of the songs written by you?
No, we just did some covers of, like, I Got My Mojo Working. I remember that was.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So it's very, very earthy. Okay.
Yeah.
So, who were the first people you went to see live?
You know, I've never been a huge gig goer, but I do remember I do remember going to see Wendy and Lisa.
All right. Okay.
One of the first gigs. I mean, that was, going with my friend, leaving my parents' house and going with a friend to a gig. Oh, and so it must have been kind of 16, 17. And so, the Prince's kind of sidekicks, immensely glamorous and cool and sexy.
Yeah.
And brilliant musicians, actually. Obviously. And so that was fun. But yeah, I've not been a huge kind of gig goer over the years.
Why not? Just don't like crowds.
I had to listen to it on the radio. Quite often I'll go and I think, well, this sounded better on your record.
No, well, it's true. It does.
That's missing the point of live performance fairly profoundly, isn't it? But I understand that.
Massively missing the point. But I went to a Bob Dylan gig once, and I was
well, here we go.
How was that? He says, expecting it to be terrible.
It was brilliant. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, it was not good. And it was at the O2. So maybe you can't really have a Bob Dylan gig that's good there.
I was at that one because I think he's only played there once, wasn't he?
Oh, right.
Yeah. Which had no screens, right? Am I right? You couldn't see. There were no big screens.
Yeah, I don't remember any screens.
So you could only see these little tiny figures. A guy turned around to me and said, "Which one's Bob Dylan?" I said, "He's the one in the white cowboy hat." He said, "I just want to check because I want to go up the front of the stage and punch him." I didn't want to get the wrong guy. Well, that summed up this experience for me.
I think that might have been my dad. I went with my dad, and he was just like, "This is unbelievable. Oh, let's go."
Well,
so
really?
The end.
So who had been the? Oh, that's interesting because who had been the instigator of you going to a gig? Was it him or you?
I think that was me, but he was quite interested. I mean, he actually was listening to Bob Dylan. So this is when I was fully, an adult, and he was listening to Bob Dylan. Actually, he was very open-minded about music, and he liked a lot of Bob Dylan songs actually by that time, or quite a few anyway. And so he was interested in going to see him, but then he was like.
So if you like to learn the Bob Dylan songs, the worst thing you can do is go and see him because you're not going to hear any Bob
trampled
Dylan
on by the man who wrote them.
You're going to hear a dull muffling sound from one end of the.
Sounds like a guy who's suffering from some terrible respiratory condition, emphysema, who's also having a nervous breakdown and in some sort of mental.
No, it's funny you going with your father because my son was about 16. He said, "I'm going to go and see all the legends before they die." Ticked them off: Lou Reed, James Brown, whatever. He said, "I want to go and see Bob Dylan." I said, "I really don't think you do want to go and see Bob Dylan." But anyway, the two of us went, and he turned around to me after the fifth number and said, "This is terrible." And it's like, well, what did your father do?
What did I tell you?
Your dad. Yeah, it's interesting, that question of whether you should go and see them, right? Because I have struggled with this. So my dad never went to see Sinatra, even though, he could have done in the last sort of decade of Sinatra. He's still doing the Royal Albert Hall now and again. But my dad was like, I don't want to see him now. And my dad was a huge fan of Sinatra, by the way. I don't know if I've made that clear, but he loved Sinatra. But he didn't want to go and see him because he thought he was over the hill and it would sort of ruin it. And I think after Sinatra died, he sort of wished that he had. It's gone. And I've never seen Paul McCartney, right?
Oh, really?
That's absolutely extraordinary. Have you never felt, desperately keen to just once see what it'd be like? Because Paul McCartney's one of those very few people who will not let you down.
He does.
Paul McCartney will play for 2.5 hours, play 8 great Wings songs, 17 or 18 amazing Beatles songs. I mean, you can't be disappointed.
I think I went through a long period where I thought, I'm not interested in him anymore, and he's over the hill, etc., etc. And it's actually really relatively recently, the last sort of 5 years, where I've kind of gone back and gone, well, hang on a minute. No, that's not right for all sorts of reasons. But also, I just thought, I don't know. I there's this fear of kind of ruining your perfect kind of image of somebody. If you go,
fair enough.
I would like to go. I did actually try and get tickets the last time he announced shows, but they seem to sell out like immediately. It's a bit weird. So
the whole Mark and I are old enough to have seen the whole process of people going to big gigs changed massively. In the, when Led Zeppelin were in the Pomp in, I don't know, 1973, 74, the only people who went to see them were people who had the greatcoats and people who, were prepared to queue up overnight at Earl's Court.
People aged about 23, whatever.
They're a very small group of, a very small, slice of the population. Yeah. Nowadays, if anything's on, your neighbors are going. People you meet at work, they're all going because, and they all say the same thing. I had to go. I felt I had to go, and you think, why?
And it's multi-generational, isn't it?
It's like Wimbledon. So rock audiences nowadays are like Wimbledon crowds. They're people who don't like tennis particularly, you know what I mean? But they just think, I've got to go. It's huge. And also social media is a massively important part of this, as my daughter pointed out to me. I said, why do all these young people want to go to Glastonbury? She said, to Instagram it and tell their mates they're at Glastonbury.
Yeah.
That's why they're doing it. And, I think that applies, in different proportions. Right?
It's so true. It's a series of experiences you have to tick off, isn't it? Yeah. Well, like your son saying he wants to go and see Dylan.
Yeah. Yes. But anyway. No, so I don't blame you. Yeah, if you're not sure about it, don't go. There's enough people. I'm sure Paul McCartney won't miss you. Don't worry.
I think he's going to be okay. But I think I would like to go and see him. I do think that to a certain extent now it becomes less about can he hit those high notes anymore? Who cares about that? It's just that thousands of people in one place saying we love you. I mean, that's what it's about. I think. And we love the Beatles. There is a kind of huge communal aspect to.
That's the thing that struck me. Thinking about your McCartney thing, which struck such a chord with loads of people. And not long afterwards, or around about the same time, there's a book about Bob Dylan published, wasn't there? And Mark and I were saying, why does thinking about Bob Dylan make people so cross? But thinking about the Beatles makes people so happy.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Yeah,
it's completely true. There's a lovely bit in your thing where you talk about how Cynthia Lennon gets hard up for cash and is forced to sell the letter that John sent her in 1965, and for a lot of money. It sells to an anonymous bidder for a huge amount of money. And a week later, the letter is returned to her in a frame with a note from Paul McCartney saying, "This is yours, and it should remain yours." You think that is absolutely the most beautiful thing in the world. Can you imagine Dylan doing that? I don't know. It's hard to tell, isn't it? McCartney is about raising the sum of human happiness. Dylan is about people kind of arguing about, I don't know, who owns him and who knows the most about him.
Well, yeah, I mean, but there's that thing about, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Dylan is there to afflict the comfortable.
Yeah.
And McCartney's better at comforting the afflicted.
Yes.
And you need both, right?
Yeah. No, fair enough. But it's the communal experience. I went to see McCartney with my entire family because all the children wanted to go. Genuinely, I didn't make them at all. They wanted to go, and they were all varying ages. And he comes on stage, and it's it's Hello Goodbye or whatever. It's Drive My Car, and you're standing there with your wife and your three, 20s and teenage and younger children, all equally enjoying this thing, and you just think that's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah,
to have lived long enough on McCartney's part to see that happen, you know what I mean, and to see it happen every night, and all those people all know those songs equally. Even though some of them have been listening to them for 60 years, some of them are listening for 5 years. It's just an absolutely amazing thing.
Yeah, and that's why he's still doing it.
Yeah. Bob Dylan, you'd never know whether he was playing the.
Well, there's a more interesting question is why Bob Dylan's still doing it, and he very much is, right? Pandemic aside, he's just been on the road all the time, and he appeared to be miserable at every gig he does, and so.
I don't agree. I totally understand why Dylan does it. Because, if you're a musician and you're touring, then you're the center of attention. Everyone's looking after you. You've got this whole structure around you. All you've got to do is move from city to city. And 2 hours a day, you get up on stage and play. And you've got a kind of reason. You've got a structure to your life. The moment that stops and you're back at home, in his case, kind of mooching about the yard, looking for something to weld. He's always welding. I think you might feel a bit lost. You'd think I'd rather be back on the road. I know where I stand.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I wonder if post-pandemic, he'll be like, you know what? Maybe I didn't need to do that.
True, it might do.
I'm happy doing my welding. Yeah.
Yeah, he was taking up jigsaws. You know,
I think he's got this old-fashioned. You know, it's very romantic and wonderful kind of idea or image of the troubadour. You know, going from town to town and playing songs and telling stories. And he feels like he's part of this kind of ancient tradition.
Yeah.
And it's more about, you know, him just being, it is about him being the center of attention in a way that McCartney's not, it's not quite the same. McCartney gets his thrill from seeing other people, you know, enjoying things and taking, that's why he doesn't play obscure songs or kind of reinvent the song too radically. Because he's like, no, I'm here because I love seeing people break down in tears at Hey Jude or whatever.
Completely.
So you said you don't hoard much stuff. You tend to throw stuff away, do you?
I mean, I did try to find some stuff, and I went through some old boxes, and I thought maybe I've got an old melody maker. And it was nothing. I really had an existential crisis. I had another midlife crisis. Like, this is it. This is what my life has come down. I've got some old pay slips from 1995, and you know, I don't know, like a copy of the New Statesman or something. There's nothing here. My life is just it's just empty. It's a box of crap. So thanks for that.
That's all right. So there must be some albums that meant a lot, though.
We talked about some of them. So that one, pretty political one. This was another one.
Oh, what a great record! Yeah, the Steve McQueen. That's the same Triumph year of Triumph that he rode in Great Escape, wasn't it? I think that he's riding on that picture.
Triumph
motorcycle. I think so.
Yeah,
it's a little detail.
Yeah. This is. I bought this in New York because it's called Two Wheels Good.
Yeah.
They got into trouble with Steve McQueen's estate. But I think Scritti and Prefab Sprout were my two huge kind of biggest bands, apart from the Beatles, obviously.
Having worked in advertising, you can answer this question, because Mark and I were only talking about Prefab Sprout the other day, and I've just realised the same thing applies to Scritti Politti. Both groups slightly handicapped by a silly name. Well, do you think that is the case?
I mean, the Beatles had a pretty.
I know.
They did, but you can't
apply their rules to anybody else.
No, I know you can't, because they're the Beatles. Now, our theory was that I just can't imagine a Radio 4 announcer saying, and 4:00 this afternoon on Radio 4, we have a documentary about the incredible Prefab Sprout. It just, you feel awkward and embarrassed that they've been saddled with this wretched name.
I would agree.
Any other name, I seriously think it hindered them. I think it handicapped them, actually.
No, that might well be right. And I think it does. It's just one of those things that he chose when he was like, you know.
Well, it was all based on Jackson, wasn't it? Hotter than a pepper sprout, wasn't it? Didn't you hear the lyric? Hotter than a pepper sprout, and think it was Prefab Sprout. Yeah. We got married in a fever. So he kind of thought, hey, that's a great name, and then you're stuck with this thing forever, because I think their legacy is dented by it, and they have made some amazing records. We once interviewed Thomas Dolby, who produced that record, on this podcast. Oh, he was fantastic about making that record. All about the marriage of Wendy Smith and Paddy's vocal. And all about those scenic and extraordinary keyboard textures, which is what makes the record, really. It really changes the sound of the group.
Right. Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
Thomas Dolby, a big part of it.
Record. His voice sounds lovely as well, you know. There was just this kind of strand of intelligent, like literate, verging on pretentious pop. You know, so they were kind of probably, you know, if you like Scritti, you may well like Prefab, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And then another book idea in praise of pretentious pop music. Nobody's ever written that.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're not short of ideas for books.
Well, no, I am. I at the moment, I'm sort of thinking, well, maybe I could write about the Beatles, but it's like an impossible, not all. We'll see if it's impossible or not. But how do you write another book? But I think that Craig Brown did about Shakespeare. Like, you know, there's going to be endless books about them. So, you know,
Craig Brown just thought of just a new approach to it. And have you read that book? Really worked.
I haven't, partly because I don't want to read it and think, oh, he's written, I can't write. Sometimes you get that feeling where you read.
Oh, I know what you mean. Somebody's been there.
Yeah.
I was a bit annoyed, actually. He did the kind of like, he's got all that kind of bitty structure.
Yeah.
Which I would like to say that's not why I wrote 64 Reasons for Paul McCartney like that. No. I was already writing my version. He actually nicked my idea.
Yeah, there you go.
That's what it was. Well, it's just the Beatles story told as a series of anecdotes, really. That's what's clever about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're short stories. And they're all based about individuals, or all based around personalities.
But he was helped hugely by the fact that he'd written the Princess Margaret book first. So when he was writing a book about the Beatles, he thought, it's like the Princess Margaret book. And it's not quite, really, but it is to a certain extent. It's them seen through the eyes of other people, isn't it?
Right. See, this is the thing. I think I haven't read it, but I'm going to talk authoritatively about it.
Yeah, go on.
It's a book about the phenomenon of the Beatles and the fame of the Beatles more than it is about the music or the
completely.
Beatles. Yeah. So I think there might be, you can come around the other side of the phenomenon. And say, let's look at the relationships between them and how they get to the music and so on. So this is all scope for.
Yeah. There's always more stuff coming out all the time. There's always a photograph you've never seen. Somebody posted, again, during the lockdown, a picture of them in Soho. Do you remember this, Mark?
Yes, it's amazing.
It taken about
you and I had never seen it.
Something like this.
We can work out exactly what corner it was taken.
We said it's on the corner of Poland Street or wherever it was, or whatever. There's a fruit market there. Look, they've got a bank of apples, and they're talking to those two girls, and you could work out what they'd been doing that day.
Yeah,
because
it was Speak Street. Yeah,
it was.
It's right where what used to be Cheapo Records was where it was. It's amazing. But I love that. It's when we read the Craig Brown book, Dave and I both noticed there's a bit about Malcolm Muggeridge. Malcolm Muggeridge is in Hamburg in 1961 or 1962, hears this music coming from a club, goes in, sees the Beatles, writes in his memoir about the Beatles. I mean, that's fantastic. And they meet him and have this conversation.
Knew that at all.
I know.
I thought I was reviewing that book for the New Statesman, and I thought, he's pulling my leg here. This is Craig Brown pastiche. He thinks he can kid us that Malcolm Muggeridge went to the Top Down Club. And I was about to write a paragraph saying, if Craig Brown thinks he can fool me, he's, But thankfully, I got hold of Malcolm Muggeridge's diaries and found, yes, he had gone to see them in 1961.
Yeah.
Which is just absolutely extraordinary.
It's interesting. And then McCartney goes to meet Bertrand Russell, in Chelsea. So it's kind of...
Oh, does
he? Yeah. He went and had tea with Bertrand Russell in 1966. It was a very McCartney thing to do at the time. He was like, "Oh, I can't fancy talking to that Bertrand Russell.
He looks clever."
Yeah, he's he's taking in modern art and music and Stockhausen and Russell. I'll go and see him. And they had a cup of tea and they talked about Vietnam. So yeah, but I think that there's still a kind of there are more stories to be written about. Partly, inspired by my piece, the fact that people I still don't understand, I think, the Lennon-McCartney relationship, or at least there's an old-fashioned kind of way of thinking about it, which I think has to be updated. There's something very kind of mysterious and fascinating about their relationship that I still think we haven't plumbed.
So that's interesting. What theories have you got about that, about the way it works?
I think we just see it. We see it in a slightly... we don't see it for what it is, which was a romantic love affair with I don't think they were having sex, but with all the other dynamics of a slightly obsessive love affair.
Yeah.
It absolutely besotted with each other and jealous all the time. And it got out of control towards the mid 60s. I think John became very frustrated with Paul not kind of being as obsessed with him as he he felt he ought to be, and that's when it started to just sort of disintegrate and then explode, and they go off and they find Yoko and Linda, and this amazing kind of parallel split where they basically kind of meet their partners and get married within days of each other. Like, it's fine, this is totally independent of what you're doing.
It's so competitive, isn't it? I know.
And it's this kind of, so I think we've talked about, people are used to the idea that they were competitive but I don't think they've really fully taken on to the extent to which they loved each other, and how that kind of rich and quite dramatic love really kind of fed into the music and the evolution of the music. So
how do you feel about because I think this is a really telling detail, or it is for me anyway, about the difference in quality between the music they produced individually after the Beatles split up? Because my feeling is that Lennon missed the contribution and the presence of McCartney far more than McCartney missed Lennon. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And but I mean, yeah, I think that John probably didn't realize how reliant he was on Paul musically, and it's not like he didn't make some couple of pretty good albums, but then his productivity kind of slows, and he's not really into it. He was really rocketed to his peaks by McCartney, and vice versa. Now, I know people say this all the time, so I'm trying to find a more original way of saying it. Maybe you can help me. But I mean, they clearly missed each other, and they spent a lot of time in the 70s talking to each other via songs.
Yeah.
And I think they did that all the way through the 60s as well. And all this stuff about how people are reading too much into our lyrics. Yeah, but I still think they were. There's a quote in the Hunter Davis book where John says, we don't really like language words, so we communicate through music. That's basically like the best way to communicate. And so I actually think you can actually look at a lot of these songs, even songs like Jealous Guy, and say, well, that's John said to Paul at one point, like, this is about you, according to Paul. And it sort of, puts these things in a new perspective. They were kind of sending messages to each other via the medium of LPs throughout that decade.
Yeah.
And I think they were edging back towards each other, and would have become friends again, I think, in the end.
Yeah, probably. But thankfully, the group never reformed. So which I always think it's the great saving grace of the Beatles story is it's
funny how nobody really mentions the brief moment when Free as a Bird came out. It's kind of almost been exercise, hasn't it? It's just been erased. Nobody talks about it. It was
so important at the time. It was important to the record company. It was important to McCartney.
Yeah,
but that whole kind of thing was a big, I think, success, wasn't it? In terms of like,
well, they sold a lot of records. It was EMI's biggest selling albums.
Yeah, it was a huge success.
Year,
it's just that nobody acknowledges it.
Yeah, but Free as a Bird is. I mean, surely nobody wants to listen to that anymore, do they? Really? I mean,
it's all right. It's got a nice George Harrison guitar solo, but I think that they might have got back together, and they might have made music together. And it would have been, I'm sure it would have been great, but it wouldn't have been. I just think the God of narrative decreed that there would be no more Beatles, and in the God of narrative is so cruel and so merciless that he had to actually knock one of them off because he saw what might happen.
It's true about the God of narrative. It's only in the last couple of years that it struck me, when it was the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road, that the Abbey Road photograph, of which they only took 6, is that right, Mark? 6,
that's right, yeah.
6 snaps, across, back, and back across. The picture tone has them leaving work for the very last time.
Walking away from the studio.
Walking away from the studio on their last day making music together. Isn't that astonishing? And they didn't see it like that. But it is.
It is.
Fabulous synchronicity.
It's just,
on a sunny day, a perfect sunny, everything about that. Not a cloud in the sky.
And the photographers managed to capture all their legs in a kind of perfect inverted.
Well, there's only one. There's only one frame where he does that.
I'm sure you've seen the others, and they're all stumbling and looking down, and smoking cigarettes, and
But then again, we did a word in your attic about a year ago, probably now, with John Kosh, who designed Abbey Road cover. And we said, "Oh, it's such a blue sky." He said, "Yeah, I made it a bit more blue."
That really interested me, because now you're used to it. Every time you see a kind of period drama on telly, or even the Antiques Roadshow, you think there's never been weather that good,
Yes, it's the association with Beatles between the Beatles and Sunshine is really interesting, particularly Sgt. Pepper. people's memories of Sergeant Pepper the week it came out were it was sunny, the sun shone. Yeah. We played it all day, you know. Oh, it did shine.
I noticed the other day that they've got 2 albums where the end of side A is kind of a really dark, bad trip. And then the beginning of side B is Sunshine. So in the end of Revolver, you have Tomorrow Never Knows, and then it's Good Day Sunshine. And then on Abbey Road is
Here Comes the Sun.
In this big swirl of horrible noise.
Yeah.
And you get these guitar chords, and it's like, oh, here comes the sun.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, we're going to take you to the depths of horror, and then Sunshine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, where were we? It's right.
It's the range. It's the range. So listen, plug your book, Ian. You got a book out called Conflicted.
Yeah, I do actually talk about because the book is about how people deal with disagreement and conflict, and now really kind of creative organizations and groups and people do it really well, like have their disagreements out in the open. And one of the strands in it, I talk about rock groups as a kind of microcosm of a kind of any kind of business, really, any organization. You've got a group of talented people who have to come together and try and make something that's more than the sum of its parts. And one of the things they have to deal with is the conflict between their egos and their points of view on things. And there's an American writer called Warren Zanes.
Oh, I know Warren.
Yeah, fantastic. Like he wrote a fantastic biography.
Tom Petty book.
Tom Petty, really good book. Yeah.
Really good book.
And I was fascinated by the politics of that band.
Because he knew them. He knew Tom, didn't he, from way back. So he spent a lot of time with them.
Spent a lot of time with them, and also he was in the Warren was in the Del Fuegos himself. Yeah. So he's kind of spent a lot of time in and around bands. And one of the things he said to me when I spoke to him was, the bands that survive and do well are not the ones who are high-fiving each other after every gig and hugging each other saying, you were fantastic. You see, when you see a band doing that, you think, yeah. The bands that'll
go wrong.
Good are the bands that learn to fall out or have very open and sometimes heated disagreements with each other, but without it exploding, and just have their disagreements out. And they do that in different ways. The Rolling Stones were quite kind of, they would just sort of hit each other now and again, and kind of, they would actually, they have a round and they would move on. So it'd be quite horrible, and then it would move on. REM, I talked to REM's manager, and he was like, well, it was quite kind of, it was just very democratic, as you'd expect for a band from Athens. They sat down and talked everything through. Every decision they made was a long debate, and at the end of it, one of them had they had a veto. So if one didn't agree with the decision, they didn't do it. So
they're a very, very rare case of that.
But also REM had a royalty split like Blur and like U2 that meant that nobody really felt left out and nobody suffered if they weren't involved in a song.
I should mention the wonderful, my favorite bit in Dan Zanes' book about Tom Petty. I don't know if you remember this here, is where the tension in the group of Heartbreakers between Mike Campbell and Stan Lynch, the drummer.
Yeah.
And they have a falling out on the road, and it's about somebody's wife, what somebody's wife says.
Yeah. God, yes.
And one of them says, I don't like your wife. And you think, whoa. Yeah. I've read some rock books. I've never read anything like that.
Yeah, there's no coming back from
there's
that.
There's no coming back from
that's
that.
Terrible.
You say you don't like you, that's fine, Even
Paul McCartney never said, I don't like Yoko.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's a terribly good book, that the Tom Petty.
It's really good, and because it's about Tom Petty, but it's also about life in a rock band.
It is. It is.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Like the split of income thing is really, because I think that kind of can be the thing that ultimately pulls a group apart.
Completely. Absolutely.
That's why REM were going for years. That's why U2 are still going.
U2 is still going. I mean, how long can it possibly last if your personal lives are so divided that one is living in some giant mansion somewhere and driving a Lamborghini,
right,
and the other's kind of in a semi-detached, kind of shuffling around, and I think the tension would be unbearable.
I think it was an underrated kind of aspect of the Beatles split as well.
Yeah.
George Harrison was, George Harrison was, I see him as the kind of the Irish border question of the Beatles. He was what Northern Ireland was to Brexit. He was kind of this thing that everybody thought, oh, we'll deal with that. It's okay with George. We'll get George's tracks onto it. And it actually became completely, impossible to reconcile.
Yeah.
That this guy was also now a fully fledged songwriter, and he wanted, and they just weren't prepared to countenance that.
Yeah. Well,
I think money was a big part of that.
Well, the Mark Lewison lecture plays a little bit of a cassette of their last ever meeting, where they're talking about they're planning the next record after Abbey Road, and George Harrison's going to have 4 tracks on it. They've decided. 2 weeks later, the band split up. So that's extraordinary. So they were changing their view.
The thing about that conversation, which I haven't heard, because when I went to see him, he'd already been mullered by the.
Yes, he couldn't play it.
But I've read kind of the transcript. Is that George? Paul says to George, "Well, I just haven't liked any of your songs so far. Like the Here Comes the Sun and Something are the two first songs that I've liked," which is incredibly
that's nice. That's charming, isn't it?
Paul. But what's interesting about it is that George does not get angry about it. He's just like, well, that's just your opinion.
Yes, that's right.
He's really calm about it, and you actually get a glimpse of how they talk to each other pretty direct. They knew each other so well.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Spent so much time together that they would just say these things to each other, and that's partly why they were good, because they could just say these things and whatever.
So there's your book, Conflicted. You also do an email newsletter. Plug that.
Yes. Oh gosh, yes. So
you may as well.
I may as well. So the email newsletter is called The Ruffian, talking about bad names. Like, it's a bit like Prefab Sprout. I just chose it because it was like a bad pun on the rough. Because I'm going to put rough things in here that I haven't finessed.
Oh, okay.
Publication. But it's just a terrible name. So The Ruffian goes out every couple of weeks, and it's kind of a treasure box of things that I found interesting and over the last couple of weeks, and notes, points of view from me on various things. It's kind of hard but people seem to really enjoy it. It's all
good. And so we traditionally finish these
greatest record,
by asking people to tell us what is the greatest record ever made.
Well, I mean, obviously it's Abbey Road. But I didn't want to say that because it's a bit boring. Well, by the way, the way I see Abbey Road now is it's their last album that they made. The fact that it ends with the end, like the picture on the front, it's one of those glorious coincidences, because so much of what the Beatles did, you just look at it, you go, I don't believe that happened. There's this thing that Rick Rubin says, which is the Beatles, I think he chooses specific years like 64, 66, but he said, this is the best argument for God's existence that you will ever hear, what the Beatles did between these years. Because it's deeply mysterious, and we'll never understand why. And I think, it implies some supernatural being was at work. And I think that about Abbey Road. But I think Abbey Road, by the way, was the first album of the next phase of the Beatles. It doesn't sound like a band, on its last legs, and it ends with the end, but it feels like them actually starting to reinvent their sound again, and move into a new era. But then, of course, Apple had Alan Klein and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so instead, I'm going to choose.
Of the rock tribute to your dad,
and it's a tribute to my dad. Now it's a perfect album, and one of the first albums in terms of here is a coherent set of songs on one LP, which are all kind of meant to be together. It's not just a collection of singles or and it's also, I just want to say, it's okay to love things where you're kind of out of time. You're in the wrong. So actually, my dad was into Sinatra, where at the end of the 50s and the early 60s, when Sinatra was already very uncool for young people. He was still selling lots to the older generation. But if you were kind of like 20 years old and you were into Sinatra, as my dad was, that was a pretty uncool thing. And I was into Billy Joel and Paul McCartney at around the same age, And sometimes you think, well, this is terrible. I should be into the music all my peers are into, or whatever's happening now. Why am I listening to these throwbacks? And but yeah, the throwbacks are often just really, really good.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Absolutely.
And, you learn. As you go through your life, you're grateful that you spent so much time with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and his phrasing, so wonderful. That's great.
Yeah.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a View.